Thanks so much, and it's an honor to be here. First of all, it's an honor to be here with Matthew and with Yossi. I've been working with Matthew, but Yossi and I go back a long way, decades, I think, of analyzing and trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian Arab-Israeli conflict. Under ordinary circumstances, I wouldn't start with this comment, but I think I must in order to ensure my self-protection in Washington these days, which has become an odd and curious place. I mean, having been here for 45 years, I can say that with some measure of authority. And let me make it very clear. I worked for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. And the dividing line, in my judgment, for U.S. foreign policy should and must not be between liberal and conservative, left and right, Republican and Democrat. The dividing line for an effective and wise American foreign policy should be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. The only thing that matters is which side of the line do you want America to be on? The smart side or the dumb side? If you want it to be on the smart side, then there are certain things that you are obliged, I would argue, that you are mandated to do with respect to borrowing good ideas and practical ideas from wherever they come, regardless of political affiliation. That's an important comment these days. I only wish that it would be absorbed by the political elites and those who guide the spirit and policy of the nation. Several months ago, I had the honor of meeting Jared Kushner. It wasn't a business meeting, it was a social meeting, but I felt obliged to tell him this. I was introduced to him and to Ivanka by the current Israeli ambassador, Ron Dermer. I said, you know, Jared, I wish my father-in-law had as much confidence in me as your father-in-law appears to have in you, because he's given you Mission Impossible. The pursuit of the ultimate deal and a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I posed the question, having spent almost 40 plus years of my 68 either analyzing this conflict, trying to figure out a way to resolve it. I pose that question to you. Is it in fact Mission Impossible? So let's quickly examine what's new and what isn't before we even begin to wrestle with conclusions that may be annoyingly negative, but may also be determinative. Number one, you have an unpredictable president, for sure, who has pledged for reasons that are beyond my capacity to understand initially, and committed the United States to achieving the ultimate deal. He may well be the first American president since Jimmy Carter to chase and pursue and to come out with such a unilateral declaration and interest in resolving the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Second, you do have a new alignment between Israel and key Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, based largely on the twin threats of a rising Iran on one hand and the ever-present problem, which will remain post-ISIS and post-defeat of ISIS, problem of Sunni radicalism and jihadi terror. Three, you do have the making, since the first time in a decade, since 2007, of, I won't call it a reconciliation, I'd call it a community coincidence of interest between Fatah on one hand and Hamas on the other. I would argue to you that anyone who believes that this is real unity should lay down and wait quietly until the feeling passes. Because the reality is that real unity would mean one thing: one gun, one authority, and one negotiator. And while I'm not here to for sure, create a brief on behalf of why we don't have a better environment for Israeli-Palestinian peace, I'm perfectly prepared to talk about Israeli settlement activity. Rarely do we concentrate on what seems to me to be a huge obstacle standing in the way of any serious negotiation, which is the reality that you do not have in the Palestinian Authority today a monopoly over the forces of violence within Palestinian society. And I'm not talking about controlling all the guns. I mean, we have 4% of the world's population in this country, and we have 42% We exceed only one other nation with more guns per capita, and that's Yemen. And that's a very sad reality, frankly. I'm not talking about controlling all the guns. I'm talking about controlling groups who aspire to challenge existing authority, whether you're the mayor of Washington, D.C., the mayor of Houston, the mayor of the town council of Chevy Chase Village, where I live not far from here. You must maintain a monopoly over the forces of violence within your society, because if you don't, your constituents won't respect you, let alone your neighbors. And today, the Palestinian national movement literally looks like Noah's Ark. There are still two of everything. Two constitutions, two statelets, two sets of security services, and two visions of where Palestine is and what it is supposed to be. Two visions of where Palestine is and what it is supposed to be. But you do have the makings of unity encouraged by a very important party, which is key to all of this, and that is Egypt. You also have the quiet pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace on the part of this administration. And I give them credit for this. They did not come out loud. The president came out with a commitment to the ultimate deal, but they've been extremely risk-averse, extremely patient, extremely reticent to reveal anything that they're doing. In fact, there's a degree of radio silence on this peace process that I have not observed in my many years following and participating in this process. Now, that either because there is nothing there, or there is actually something to protect. And I'm not going to prejudge it because I simply do not know. And finally, what also is new and negative. If you asked me, is this a time, a propitious time to pursue a comprehensive settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would say no. The region is so unsettled, so uncertain, that the notion of making an investment under these circumstances by any of the parties seems to me to be a fraught enterprise. I would also add this. There was a time, in my own view of the region, that I really did believe that solving the Palestinian issue was central to American credibility and prestige and American interest. Even if I still believe that today, it is not possible to argue that with a straight face. The Middle East is a broken, angry, and dysfunctional place. The headlines are bad. I would argue the trend lines are even worse. You do not have real leaders willing to rise above their narrow sectarian, partisan, corporatist affiliations to think about the interests of the nation as a whole. You do not have states, many, four in particular, that can control their own territory, let alone create social and political compacts between the governed and those who govern. You've got a number of transnational groups which are capable of asserting their power and influence in the region and outside. And as far as the Arab Spring is concerned, I remember in the spring of 2011, I was hammered and criticized fundamentally by those who argued that this was a rare moment, and it was a rare moment. But as Tacitus, the first century Roman historian, argued, the best day after the death of a bad emperor is always the first day. And there were hopes and dreams and expectations that, frankly, could not be met, given the nature of political structure and how things change and why in this region. So I'm not arguing, I think it's worth considering whether or not you've got the kind of secure regional environment that's conducive to peace. So what's old? Well, what's old is easy. You've got three missing ingredients. You give me two of these three missing ingredients and I would give you a real chance to reach them. Number one, you need leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies and their own constituencies. I mean, if John Keegan were still alive, the military historian, he would argue 6 men between 1920 and 1950 fundamentally changed the face of the Western world, both for good or ill. 6 individuals. Every time we've had a breakthrough in this region, it's always been because you had leaders, mostly men, who for any number of reasons were able to make decisions and to deliver their constituencies. You don't have that today. Second, you don't have ownership. Israelis and Palestinians do not care enough about making those kinds of decisions as the external parties. And there's the old expression in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. It's a profound piece of political philosophy. You do not wash rental cars because you care only about what you own, and there is insufficient ownership. It is not a coincidence that the three breakthroughs, and there have only been three, that have occurred in the history of the Arab-Israeli peace process occurred without the knowledge of the United States. I'll say it again, without the knowledge of the United States. Diane, showing up here in October of '77, briefed my colleagues and predecessors at the State Department that he'd been meeting secretly with Sadat Vice President Tahami. I was on vacation in Florida when the State Department Operations Center called and said Secretary Christopher is headed out to California to meet Norwegian Foreign Minister Holst and Foreign Minister Perez. The Israelis and Palestinians have reached an agreement. They want to sign it on the White House lawn. An Israeli and Jordanian contest had been going on for decades in the pre-state period. That's ownership. And if, in fact, the parties are prepared to own it, the United States can play a role. And which brings me to my final point, the absence of effective American mediation. You need an administration that knows exactly what it can do and what it cannot do, and you need an administration, it's not going to come as a shocker, that is prepared to apply ample amounts of honey, but also a fair amount of vinegar. Because if you want to be loved as a broker and as a mediator, find another conflict to manage. You won't. Kissinger, Carter, and Baker are the only three Americans who substantively contributed in any way, frankly, to any sort of determinative solutions or progress in this process. They all wrestled with the Israelis and the Arabs, and I might add, most of the American Jewish community as well. They were all appreciated, I would argue, after the fact. Nonetheless, you're going to need honey and you're going to need vinegar. My conclusion is very simple, and that is to imagine the following scenario, and I choose my words very carefully, of a conflict-ending solution between Israelis and Palestinians is to imagine, in my opinion, almost the unthinkable and the unimaginable. To imagine an Israeli prime minister standing before the Knesset and a Palestinian president before the Palestinian Legislative Council, who on the same day, at the same hour, make the same statement to their respective publics and the world along the following lines. We do not have peace. That's a question of attitude transformation. But on the 6 core issues that drive our conflict, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, and end of all claims and conflict, it's over. There are no more irredenta to be pursued, no more claims to be adjudicated. The conflict is over. I'm sorry. And I'll never say never. I've got a 37 and a 35-year-old. And I occupy a space for a tiny period of time in this world. And I'm not going to say never. It's morally unconscionable. I would never do that to my kids, let alone to the Israelis and the Palestinians. But and nor have I given up hope. But I can no longer abide my illusions because they are dangerous. They really are. I'm with Jack Kennedy here. Be an idealist without illusions. That's what we need to be when it comes to the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace. An idealist without illusions. So, on the eve of what may be a Trump initiative, end of year, early next, which I would argue probably will be composed of 3 parts. 1, a statement of general principles purporting to address the core issues in some fashion. 2, a set of political and economic confidence building measures in which the Trump administration has invested heavily. And 3, an Arab state piece of this approach, a series of interlocked sequential steps that key Arab states are prepared to take if, in fact, Israelis and Palestinians are prepared to reciprocate in kind. I would argue that's a reasonable approach. I do not believe, however, it has much of a chance to succeed. And finally, I think we will remain trapped, not necessarily with an end of the world, what I call cosmic oy vey outcome to relations between Israelis and Palestinians, but we're going to remain trapped between a 2-state solution that people do not want to abandon for whatever the reason, and a 2-state solution that's impossible right now to implement. That's the space within which Israel, the United States, and whoever else wants to become part of this process is going to operate. Thank you very much.